The day Jacob Monroe rode into Cold Creek, Texas, the dust rose up around his horse's hooves like the town itself was trying to warn him away. It was the summer of 1878, the kind of summer that turned the Texas panhandle into a skillet and cooked everything slow beneath a sky so wide and pale it barely looked blue anymore. Jacob had been riding since before dawn, having left the town of Amarillo 2 days prior with nothing more than his saddlebag, his lawyer's satchel, and the folded letter from his client, a rancher named Harlan Boggs, who claimed that a neighboring landowner had been pushing fence posts 600 yards into his grazing territory. It was not the sort of work that Jacob loved. He had not gotten into land law because he found it thrilling. He had gotten into it because a man needed a living, and Jacob Monroe had a particular kind of mind that liked order and clarity and the satisfaction of a problem resolved. Land disputes were solvable problems. People, in his experience, were considerably less so. Cold Creek was not what he expected. Most of these small panhandle towns were alike in their desolation, a collection of sun-bleached boards nailed together into storefronts that looked like they were perpetually on the verge of giving up. But Cold Creek had a bit more life to it. The main street was wide and unpaved, packed earth the color of old bones, but there were real glass windows in several of the storefronts. There was a proper hotel, a 2-story affair with a painted sign that read Holt's Inn in letters that had once been read. There was a barber shop, a dry goods store, a telegraph office, and on the corner, a saloon called the Dusty Boot that was already doing business despite the fact that it was not yet 10 in the morning. Jacob tied his horse, a big roan gelding he called General, to the post outside the hotel, smoothed the front of his vest, and reached back to grab his satchel. He had a meeting scheduled with the county clerk at noon, and with the land surveyor at 3. Before any of that, he needed a room, a meal, and about 20 minutes of sitting still, because his lower back had begun to lodge a serious complaint somewhere around the 30-mile mark of the day's ride. He was pushing through the door of Holt's Inn when he nearly collided with a woman coming the other direction at a pace that suggested she was either late for something important or running from something entirely. She was not small. She was not the kind of woman who shrank into corners and apologized for taking up space. She came to just below his chin, which meant she stood a good 5 feet and 6 inches in her boots, and she carried herself like someone who had learned early that the world did not make room unless you insisted upon it. Her hair was the color of dark copper, the deep reddish-brown of good mahogany, and most of it was escaping from the pins she'd used to put it up, so that loose strands framed a face that was striking in the way that honest things are striking, not ornate or deliberately beautiful but real and luminous and immediate. Her eyes, which snapped up to meet his when she nearly walked into his chest, were the color of winter sage, a soft green-gray that was hard to look away from. "Pardon me," she said, not particularly apologetically. "My fault entirely," Jacob said, stepping aside and reaching up to touch the brim of his hat. She moved past him without further ceremony, tucking a leather folio under her arm and descending the front steps of the hotel with the particular energy of a woman who had a great deal to accomplish, and not nearly enough time in which to accomplish it. Jacob watched her go for exactly 1 moment longer than was polite, then turned and went inside. The hotel clerk, a round-faced boy of about 17, got him set up in a room on the 2nd floor overlooking the street. Jacob set his satchel on the bed, washed the trail dust from his face and hands using the basin and pitcher provided, changed into a clean shirt, and went downstairs to the small dining room adjoining the lobby, where a woman of about 50 was serving cornbread and salt pork to 2 cowboys who were eating with the focused intensity of men who had not had a proper meal in several days. Jacob ordered the same, drank 2 cups of strong black coffee, and studied the papers from his satchel while he ate. The Boggs land dispute was not complicated in its facts, but was complicated in its politics. Harlan Boggs was a cattleman with money and influence, but so was the man he was disputing against, a fellow named Jacob Wainwright, who owned the property to the south and east of Boggs's ranch. The Wainwright parcel was the larger of the two, and according to Boggs, Wainwright's hands had been pushing fence lines further north each season for the past 3 years. Jacob had the original survey documents, the ones done back in 1871, and a more recent survey ordered by Boggs that showed a discrepancy of nearly 800 acres. The matter had escalated to the point where Boggs had sent for a proper attorney from Amarillo, which was Jacob. He was reviewing the survey comparison when the innkeeper's wife, a Mrs. Holt with iron-gray hair and sharp eyes, came to clear his plate and noticed the papers spread before him. "You the lawyer come about the Boggs land?" she asked. "I am Jacob Monroe." She made a small sound that was not quite approval and not quite disapproval. "You've got yourself a complicated situation, Mr. Monroe." "They usually are." "Gerald Wainwright's dead," she said simply, refilling his coffee without asking. Jacob looked up. "I beg your pardon. Died 4 months ago. Heart gave out on him. The land's in dispute now between his daughter and his business partner, a man named Rutherford Cal. Cal's claiming Wainwright promised him a portion of the east parcel in exchange for a loan that never got properly papered. And then there's your Mr. Boggs on the north side saying the fence is wrong." She set the coffee pot down and folded her arms. "I'd say you've ridden into quite the tangle, Mr. Monroe." "It appears so," Jacob said slowly. He was already rethinking the timeline of his trip. He had planned on being back in Amarillo within the week, but if Gerald Wainwright was deceased and the estate was itself contested, then the matter had several more layers than Boggs had indicated in his letter. He arrived at the county clerk's office at 11:45, was told the clerk was running behind, and spent 15 minutes sitting on a wooden bench in the small outer office reading through survey notes when the door opened, and the copper-haired woman from the hotel came in. She was still carrying her leather folio, and she still had that particular electric quality to her movements, like someone who had too many thoughts happening at once and was struggling to keep them all moving in the same direction. She stopped when she saw him. Something flickered across her expression, not quite recognition because she clearly did not know him, but something that registered that she had seen him before. "Mr. Monroe," the clerk called from the inner office. "That's me," Jacob said, standing. "I'm next," the woman said, not to Jacob but to the clerk, in a tone that made it clear she was not stating a preference but a fact. "Ma'am, this gentleman had a noon appointment," the clerk said. "And I have been waiting since 10 o'clock this morning, when I was told the clerk would be available momentarily." She said the word momentarily with a precision that suggested she had been quietly furious about it for a full hour and 45 minutes. Jacob turned to look at her fully. "What's your business with the clerk, if you don't mind my asking?" She did, in fact, mind his asking, based on the look she gave him. But something shifted in her face when she looked at his satchel and the rolled survey documents tucked under his arm. "I am here regarding the Wainwright land," she said. Jacob felt something click into place in his mind, the way the pieces of a complicated problem sometimes arrange themselves suddenly into a comprehensible shape. "You're the daughter." She drew herself up slightly. "I'm Lillian Wainwright, yes, and you are representing Harlan Boggs." "Jacob Monroe, and yes, I am." They regarded each other for a moment across the small waiting room with its smell of paper and linseed oil and the particular dry heat of a Texas afternoon seeping through the single window. "Well," she said finally, "I suppose we ought to speak with the clerk together then, since we are clearly going to need to speak with each other regardless." It was not warmly offered. It was practically offered, in the manner of someone who had learned that efficiency was a survival skill. But Jacob appreciated it anyway, because the alternative would have been posturing and delay, and he had quite enough of both on the ride down. They went in together. The clerk, a Mr. Horatio Finch who was small and precise, and wore the expression of a man permanently surprised to find himself responsible for anything, spread the land records across his desk and walked them through the registered boundaries. The original 1871 survey had been done by a man named Eastman, who had since died. The 1876 Boggs survey showed a significantly different northern boundary line on the Wainwright parcel. But Finch also produced something that Jacob had not been expecting, a record of a third survey, done in 1873 by a surveyor named DeLacy, which had been filed by Gerald Wainwright and which split the difference between the other two. 3 surveys, Jacob said. 3 surveys, Finch confirmed miserably, as though he too wished there were fewer. Lillian was leaning over the desk, her finger tracing the boundary lines on the 1873 document. DeLacy's survey is the most recent properly filed one, she said, which should make it the operative document. Boggs disputes the accuracy of DeLacy's work, Jacob said carefully. She looked at him sideways. On what grounds? On the grounds that DeLacy was paid by your father to do the survey. A color rose in her cheeks. Not embarrassment, Jacob noted. Anger. But she kept her voice even. My father paid for an accurate survey, Mr. Monroe. That is what surveyors are generally hired to do. Boggs's position is that the incentive structure created a bias in the outcome. That is a very polite way of accusing my father of conspiring with a surveyor to steal 800 acres of cattle land from a man who is himself perfectly capable of stealing land without anyone's help. Jacob held up one hand. I am not accusing anyone of anything, Miss Wainwright. I am representing a client and explaining his position. Mrs. Wainwright, she corrected, and something in the way she said it made Jacob look at her more carefully. She wore no ring. The correction seemed to be one of habit rather than pride, and there was no softness in it. Mrs. Wainwright, he amended. My apologies. She turned back to the clerk and the documents with the air of someone closing a parenthesis. What I need, Mr. Finch, is the original field notes from Eastman's 1871 survey. If we can establish the original boundary markers that Eastman placed, we don't need to argue about which subsequent survey is more reliable. We can simply measure from the original markers. Jacob paused. It was, he had to acknowledge internally, a very good idea. It was, in fact, the cleanest possible solution to the survey problem, and it had not occurred to him, which was somewhat humbling. Do you have Eastman's field notes? He asked the clerk. Finch rummaged. He rummaged for a considerable time, while Jacob and Lillian Wainwright stood on opposite sides of the desk in the hot little office, not looking at each other, until Finch produced a water-stained journal that he handled with the reverence of someone who understood that fragile things, once broken, did not unbreak. These are Eastman's original notes from the 1871 survey of the Cold Creek Valley parcels, Finch said. Lillian reached for them at the same moment Jacob did. Their hands were 3 inches apart over the desk. They both stopped. Perhaps, Jacob said, we could look at them together. She considered this the way she seemed to consider most things, with a directness that was neither hostile nor particularly comfortable. Very well, she said. They spent 2 hours in that office. What Jacob discovered in those 2 hours was several things. First, that Lillian Wainwright had a mind that was organized, thorough, and quick, and that she had clearly been managing the business affairs of the Wainwright ranch on her own for some time, possibly even before her father's death. Second, that Eastman's original field notes contained references to 3 specific stone markers that he had set as boundary posts at the northwest, northeast, and southeast corners of the Wainwright parcel, and that if those markers could be located, the boundary question would essentially answer itself. Third, and this was the thing that complicated everything further, that a man named Rutherford Cal had filed a legal claim on the eastern portion of the Wainwright land just 6 weeks after Gerald Wainwright's death, claiming an oral promise of property as repayment for a loan of $4,000. This is the first I'm hearing about Cal, Jacob said when they were back on the street outside the clerk's office, the heat pressing down on them like a wool blanket. Rutherford Cal is a snake in a good suit, Lillian said, with the calm certainty of someone who has arrived at a conclusion through sustained evidence rather than emotion. He lent my father money when the cattle prices fell 3 years ago. My father has had been repaying the loan in regular installments. There was no agreement regarding land. There were no papers indicating any such agreement because no such agreement existed. Do you have the repayment records? I have some of them. A number of my father's papers are in disarray. He was not. She paused in a way that suggested she was editing something more personal, a careful record keeper in his final year. Jacob turned his hat in his hands for a moment, standing in the baking street. Mrs. Wainwright, this matter has become considerably more complex than I was led to believe when I accepted the engagement from Boggs. You are dealing with a boundary dispute on your northern line and a fraudulent land claim on your eastern line simultaneously. I'm aware of that, she said, and you have been dealing with it alone. Something moved in her face then, something that she did not let become anything visible, but that he caught the edge of anyway, the way you catch movement in your peripheral vision. It was there and then it was not, replaced by the same composed directness she wore like a second skin. My brother was supposed to come from San Antonio, she said. He decided not to. He believes the ranch should be sold and the proceeds divided. She looked down the street, squinting against the glare. I was born on that land, Mr. Monroe. I have no intention of selling it. Jacob found himself thinking that he believed her absolutely. He also found himself thinking that he should, logically, now contact Harlan Boggs and explain that the situation on the ground was considerably different from what had been described, and that resolving the northern boundary was going to require a joint survey operation that would take time and probably negotiation, rather than a simple legal presentation to the county clerk. He should send a telegram to Boggs, and then probably find a way to spend the next 2 weeks in Cold Creek without spending all of them in the company of Lillian Wainwright, who was his opposing party's closest relation, and a woman who made him forget, intermittently, what he had been thinking about. What he actually said was, "Do you know where Eastman's boundary markers are likely to be located?" She looked at him. "My father always said the northwest marker was somewhere near the creek bed where the cottonwoods start. He pointed it out to me once when I was young." "I'd like to find those markers," Jacob said. "So would I. Then perhaps we should find them together," he said. "If the markers confirm the 1871 boundaries, then the question of which subsequent survey is accurate becomes moot, and Boggs's claim loses its foundation. If they confirm Boggs's survey, then we have a different conversation." She studied him for a long moment. "You're suggesting that you, as Boggs's attorney, help me establish evidence that may undermine your own client's position. I'm suggesting that if the evidence exists, it will be found eventually regardless of my involvement. I'd rather know what we're dealing with than win an argument based on incomplete information." "That's either very honest or very clever," she said. "I've been told it can be both," he said, and something in his tone must have surprised her because a brief smile appeared on her face, there and gone like a bird startled out of a bush, but real, and it altered everything about her face when it appeared. "All right, Mr. Monroe," she said. "Tomorrow morning, then. I'll meet you here at 6 before the heat sets in." He tipped his hat. She walked away. He stood in the street for a moment, watching the dust settle behind her, and told himself very firmly to stop. The saloon that evening was what saloons in that part of Texas were in 1878. Dim, loud enough to cover a conversation but quiet enough to hear trouble starting, with a smell of sawdust and whiskey and the particular earthiness of too many men in a small space. Jacob did not drink heavily as a rule, but he had 2 fingers of rye at the bar and allowed the barkeep, a talkative man named Delbert who appeared to know everything that happened in Cold Creek, to give him an education. Gerald Wainwright, Delbert explained, had been a decent man, not without faults, who had built the Double W Ranch from a homestead claim his own father had filed in 1866. He had been a widower for 15 years, his wife having died of fever when Lillian was 12. Lillian had run the household from that age and had taken on a significant portion of the ranch's business operations after her father's first heart episode 3 years prior. "She's something," Delbert said, wiping a glass in a circular motion. "Not married." "She mentioned a late husband," Jacob said, looking at his glass. "Married a man named Creston. He was a foreman out at the Miller place. Good man, people say. Died about 2 years ago, kicked by a horse. Bad luck and bad timing." Delbert shook his head. "She came back to the Double W after that. She and her father were close those last 2 years, even if they argued about the money and how things were managed." Jacob set his glass down. He had no particular reason to feel anything about this information beyond a professional awareness that the person on the other side of his legal problem was a woman who had sustained considerable loss in a short span of time and was now fighting to protect the last thing she had. That was useful to understand from a strategic perspective. It told him how hard she would fight and in what directions. He went up to bed, lay on the thin mattress in the room overlooking the street, listened to the sounds of the town settling itself for the night, and thought about the survey problem. The markers, if they existed and could be found, would be the key. He fell asleep with the surveyor's notes half-read on the pillow beside him. She was already at the meeting point when he arrived the next morning, 5:55 by his pocket watch, sitting on a gray mare with a rifle in the saddle scabbard, and her copper hair already threatening to escape its pins in the early morning wind. She had brought a ranch hand named Hector, a quiet Mexican man of about 40 with the patient eyes and steady hands of someone who had spent his life working outdoors and had made peace with it. Jacob had brought nothing but his horse and himself, which Lillian seemed to note but not criticize. They rode south along the main road for about a mile before turning onto a rutted track that led across the wide, pale grass of the valley. The morning was cool in the way that Texas mornings are cool in summer, briefly and generously. The temperature already climbing but not yet brutal. The sky a luminous pale gold in the east where the sun was hauling itself up over the flat edge of the world. Jacob rode beside Lillian. Hector rode a few lengths behind, seemingly content with the arrangement. "Tell me about the DeLacy survey," Jacob said. "Were you present for it?" "I was not. My father arranged it without consulting me, which was not unusual." She kept her eyes on the track ahead. He was a man who believed in handling his own affairs, even when he was no longer entirely capable of it. "Did you know about the dispute with Boggs at the time?" "I knew they had argued about the fence line. My father said Boggs was always encroaching and was finally trying to make it official by claiming the land had always been his. He hired DeLacy to prove the fence was in the right place." "And was it?" She was quiet for a moment. "I believe the fence was put more or less in the right place, but I also know my father was proud and sometimes let that lead him further than was warranted." She glanced at him. "I'm not saying the 1873 survey is inaccurate. I'm saying the original Eastman markers are the cleanest answer." "I agree with you," Jacob said. She seemed to find this unexpected. "Most men in your profession don't readily agree with the opposing party." "Most men in my profession are arguing with other lawyers. You're not a lawyer." "No," she said, with a dry edge to it. "I'm merely the person whose land is at stake." They reached the Northern Creek line around 7 in the morning. The cottonwoods Lillian had described were there, a loose stand of them along the low bank of a seasonal creek that was running thin and clear in the summer heat. The ground here was different from the open range, softer beneath the shade, with a mat of root and leaf that had built up over decades. Hector dismounted and began searching the base of the largest cottonwood, moving methodically through the underbrush with a machete he had brought for exactly this purpose. Jacob and Lillian worked along the creek bank on foot, the survey notes in Jacob's hand, looking for the secondary descriptors that Eastman had noted. A rock formation he described as 3 stones in the shape of a boot heel, 30 yards northwest of the primary marker. It was Lillian who found the marker. She had moved away from the creek bank and up a small rise, pushing through knee-high grass, and then she stopped. "Mr. Monroe," she said, with a particular quality of stillness in her voice. He crossed to her. Half buried in the grass at the top of the rise, leaned slightly by time and weather but unmistakably intentional, was a flat sandstone slab about the size of a man's boot, with a chiseled notch in the upper corner and a square cut on the face. It was exactly as Eastman had described it in his field notes. Jacob crouched beside it. He looked at it for a long moment, then up at the horizon line to the north, measuring the angle with his eyes the way the field notes described. "This confirms the 1873 line," he said quietly. "If this is in the original position, the fence is more or less where Eastman put the boundary in 1871. Lillian stood very still. He could feel her trying not to show how much she cared about what he had just said. "Which means Boggs's claim," she said carefully, "is not supported by the original survey markers," he finished. He stood up, brushing grass from his knees. "Which is what I will need to report to my client." She turned to look at him then, and there was something unguarded in her expression for just that moment, the particular vulnerability of someone who has been fighting very hard and has just been told that they may, in fact, win. It was a raw and real thing to see on her face, and Jacob felt it in his chest like a hand had briefly closed around something there. "Thank you," she said, and the two words carried considerable weight. "We still need to find the other two markers," he said, not because he had forgotten what the moment was, but because he was, by nature and by training, someone who moved forward. "And you still have Cal's claim to deal with." The return of practicality in her face was not disappointment. It was something more like relief, the expression of someone who is more comfortable in motion than in stillness. "Yes," she said. "One problem at a time." They found the northeast marker that afternoon, after a long morning and a midday rest in the partial shade of a cluster of scrub oaks, where Hector produced tortillas and dried beef from a saddlebag, with the matter-of-fact generosity of a man who simply fed people when it was time to eat. They ate sitting on the ground in the shade, Jacob and Lillian and Hector, and the silence among them was not awkward, which surprised Jacob, because he was usually uncomfortable with silence unless he was alone. "How long have you been practicing law?" Lillian asked, pulling apart a tortilla. 8 years, he said. "I read law in Memphis, passed the bar in 1870, came west in 1872. "Why west?" He thought about it honestly before answering. "Because East felt finished," he said. "My family was from Tennessee. The war left things broken in a way I didn't know how to fix, and I was 22 years old and I thought distance might clarify things." "Did it?" "Some things," he said. "Not others." She was looking at him with that winter sage gaze that he was beginning to understand was simply her default mode, attentive and direct, not invasive but genuinely present. "You don't have family here." "Not yet," he said, and then thought that was an odd way to put it. She said, "I've never been anywhere but Texas." "Do you want to be?" She considered this seriously. "Sometimes I think I'd like to see the ocean, but when I imagine actually leaving," she gestured at the vast pale landscape around them, "I can't picture it clearly. The ranch is what I know, it's what's mine." Hector said something quiet in Spanish, and she responded easily and then said to Jacob, "He says the second marker should be near the old cattle road, another quarter-mile east." It was. By late afternoon they had confirmed 2 of the 3 markers, both of which aligned with the 1873 de Lacy survey rather than with Boggs's claims. Jacob documented everything carefully in his own journal, noting distances, angles, and the condition of the markers. He would need to get the county surveyor out here to make it official, but the evidence was already compelling. They rode back to town in the long gold light of late afternoon, the shadow of 3 horses stretching east across the grass. Jacob rode beside Lillian and thought about what he was going to say to Harlan Boggs, and whether Boggs was going to be reasonable about it, and whether he usually was, which his limited experience of Boggs suggested was not exactly Boggs's defining characteristic. "I need to send a telegram to my client," he said as they came into the edge of town. "The findings today significantly change the nature of his claim. Will he accept them?" "That depends on what kind of man he is when he's losing," Jacob said honestly. Something in her expression suggested she appreciated the honesty more than a reassurance would have cost him. He sent the telegram to Boggs that evening, laying out the situation plainly. He ate dinner at the hotel dining room and had just finished when Lillian came in, not to eat, but to speak to Mrs. Holt about something, and Mrs. Holt directed her to the dining room because there was a letter waiting for her at the front desk. She collected it, noticed Jacob at his table, and he half rose, which she waved off. "Sit down, Mr. Monroe," she said, but she sat across from him anyway because the other tables were occupied and she did not want to read the letter in the lobby. He watched her face as she read it. She was very controlled, but there was a small tightening around her eyes and mouth that told him the letter contained nothing good. "Cal," she said, folding it with precise movements. "Bad news. He's filed a formal complaint with the county court. He wants a hearing within 30 days to establish his claim to the eastern portion." She set the folded letter on the table. "I have 30 days to produce evidence that my father made no such promise." "The repayment records," Jacob said, "some of which I have. Some of which are missing." She pressed her lips together briefly. "My father kept his financial records in a box in his study. When I returned to the ranch after the funeral, several of the papers were out of order. At the time I thought it was simply disorganization. Now I wonder. You think Cal took documents?" "I think Cal is not a man who leaves things to chance," she said. "He has been in and out of the house on the pretense of settling the estate. He was my father's business associate and presented himself as a family friend. I trusted him to a point." Her jaw tightened. "I should not have." Jacob had set his coffee cup down and was thinking. "Do you have anything in writing from your father about the loan? Letters, any kind of notation?" "There are his account ledgers. He kept those separately, and Cal would not have had easy access to them. The ledgers should show the regular repayments. If they show consistent repayment installments over 3 years, that is significant evidence against the existence of a land promise arrangement. A man who was repaying a loan in cash installments was not acting like a man who believed the debt was being settled in property." She looked at him. "You're helping me again." "I'm thinking aloud," he said. "Whether you make use of it is your decision. You represent Boggs." "The Boggs matter and the Cal matter are separate issues," he said. "I have no obligation to Boggs that requires me to be useless to a woman being defrauded on a different question." She studied him the way she had studied the survey documents, carefully, looking for inconsistencies. "Most men who had no obligation would still not involve themselves," she said. "I'm not most men," he said simply, and picked up his coffee cup. The dining room around them was quiet in the way that small-town dining rooms are quiet in the evening, distant and muffled, the sound of other lives going on at a remove. A lamp on the table between them threw warm light across the space. Lillian's copper hair had lost its battle with its pins completely by now, and she had given up on reconstructing the arrangement, so it hung loose over one shoulder in a way that she seemed to have stopped noticing. Jacob noticed, but he did not mention it. "My father's ledgers are at the ranch," she said. "I need to go through them and document the relevant entries. That would take a day, I expect. At least a day. There are 3 years of records." "I could help," he said. "I've gone through enough financial ledgers in legal cases to know what to look for." "You seem very determined to be useful to me, Mr. Monroe," she said, and there was something in it that was not quite a deflection and not quite an invitation but lived in the space between. "I believe in doing what's right," he said, "and the right thing here is fairly clear to me regardless of who I was hired by." She was quiet for a moment. Then, "My father would have liked you." It was not a small thing to say, and she said it as though she knew that, as though she had weighed it and decided to say it anyway. "I would have liked to meet him," Jacob said. He meant it. She looked down at the folded letter on the table. "Come to the ranch on Friday," she said. "I'll have Mrs. Garza cook something and we can go through the ledgers properly." "I'll be there," he said. She stood, tucked the letter into her folio, and left the dining room with her habitual purposeful stride. Jacob watched the empty doorway for a moment and then looked down at his coffee cup and made himself think about survey markers. He was not entirely successful. The telegram response from Harlan Boggs arrived the next morning, and it was not the response of a reasonable man. Boggs demanded that Jacob appear in person at the Boggs Ranch, which was 30 miles from Cold Creek, to discuss the matter. He did not accept Jacob's findings. He referred to DeLacy as a crooked surveyor hired by a crooked rancher, which, since Gerald Wainwright was dead, and his daughter was the one who would be present for any discussion, was both insulting and not particularly useful. He said he had not paid Jacob's retainer for Jacob to come back empty-handed. Jacob wrote back a telegram that was carefully worded and firmly clear. He explained that the Eastman markers existed, that they could be verified, and that proceeding with the original claim in light of this evidence would expose Boggs to a counterclaim that was unlikely to go his way. He told Boggs he could come to Cold Creek to discuss it in person, or he could instruct Jacob to pursue a negotiated settlement, or he could find different representation. He sent the telegram, and then went and found the county surveyor, a tall, laconic man named Jim Brewer, who had the angular certainty of someone who measured things for a living, and did not like anything that could not be measured. Brewer agreed to ride out to the Wainwright Northern line within the week to officially document the markers. Jacob arranged this, then walked across the main street to the telegraph office, where he sent a second telegram, this one to a colleague in Amarillo asking for any public record information on a Rutherford cow, including business dealings, legal filings, and anything else that might be on record. He spent the rest of that day and the next in Cold Creek proper, having conversations with the county court clerk about the cow filing, reviewing the legal standards for an oral contract claim in Texas in 1878, which were not particularly favorable to Cal's position in the absence of written documentation, and generally making himself as useful as a man can make himself in a small town with limited resources and a complicated case. On Thursday evening, he sat on the hotel's narrow porch watching the sunset turn the street the color of fired copper, and thought about Lillian Wainwright, and told himself he was thinking about her because she was central to the legal matters he was managing. This was not entirely dishonest. She was central to the legal matters. It was just not the whole truth, and Jacob Monroe was, at his core, a man who valued the whole truth, which was making the current situation somewhat inconvenient. He had been alone for 31 years, which was his age, and he had not been unhappy about it in the way that other men seemed to think he ought to be. His work satisfied him. His own company did not trouble him. He had women friends in Amarillo, professional acquaintances who respected his mind, and he had a full and real life that left him little reason to examine what might be missing from it. He had not been looking for anything when he rode into Cold Creek, and he was rather irritated with himself for looking now. The ranch road to the Double W was well kept, which told Jacob something about how the operation was being managed. The fences along the road were straight and recently maintained. The cattle he could see in the distance were healthy-looking stock, good beef cattle in a summer that had not been easy on grazing. Whatever else was complicated about the Wainwright situation, the ranch itself was in sound condition, and that was Lillian's work. It had to be. The house was a substantial one for that part of Texas, wood-framed with a proper covered porch along the front and a stone chimney at each end. It had clearly been added to over the years, sections of different ages apparent in the architecture, the whole thing adding up to something that was less elegant than it was lived in and real. There were 2 dogs in the yard, a barn visible behind the house, and smoke rising from the kitchen chimney. Lillian met him on the porch. She was dressed differently today, a simpler dress without the formal quality she wore in town, and her hair was braided and pinned more practically. She looked younger out here, or perhaps just less defended, the way that people sometimes look when they are on their own ground. "Mr. Monroe," she said, "Mrs. Wainwright," he said, stepping down from General and looping the reins over the porch rail. "This is a fine property." Something warm and complicated went through her face. "Thank you," she said. "Come inside." Mrs. Garza, a small, energetic woman who appeared to run the house with absolute authority, had made a substantial midday meal of roasted chicken and corn and fresh bread, which she set before them in the dining room without ceremony, and then returned to the kitchen and left them to it. Jacob ate with honest appreciation, and Lillian watched this with what he interpreted as a certain satisfaction, the expression of someone whose hospitality has been genuinely received. After the meal they moved to the study, which was a moderate-sized room lined with shelves of account books and cattle records, a large desk in the center, and two windows that looked out on the barn and the back pasture. The afternoon light came through the west-facing windows in long gold bars. It was hot but not intolerable. Lillian had already pulled the ledger books from the shelf and stacked them on the desk. There were 7 of them, thick-bound volumes covering the years 1872 through 1878. Jacob rolled up his sleeves, which he noticed Lillian notice and then look away from, and they settled into work. The work was meticulous and in some ways absorbing. Gerald Wainwright had been, as Lillian had said, an inconsistent record keeper, but his inconsistency ran in patterns. He recorded cattle sales very carefully, payroll somewhat carefully, and personal expenses almost not at all. The loan from Cal appeared first in the 1875 ledger, recorded simply as loan RC $4,000 OCT. And then, beginning in January of 1876, there were regular entries, the first Monday of each month, of RC payment $80. They were there month after month through 1876, through 1877, and into 1878, with 2 gaps where Gerald Wainwright had clearly forgotten to record. But the pattern was so consistent that the gaps read as recording omissions rather than payment omissions. 40 payments at $80, Jacob said, doing the arithmetic. That's $3,200 repaid against a $4,000 loan over 3.5 years. Which means there's still $800 outstanding, Lillian said, which is a reasonable amount to still owe on a loan of that size at that stage. It does not suggest a loan that was being settled in property. Jacob looked up from the ledger. "This is solid evidence, Mrs. Wainwright. Any reasonable judge will see that your father was treating this as a cash repayment loan, not a property arrangement. But it doesn't prove that Cal never claimed a property promise," she said, twisting a pencil in her fingers. "He'll simply say my father was honoring the cash payments while separately expecting the land to be the final settlement. Which is why we need your father's correspondence," Jacob said. "If Cal ever wrote to your father about the loan terms, even once, those letters would be illuminating. Did your father keep correspondence?" She stood and crossed to the shelving on the far wall, pulling down a wooden box. "He kept letters," she said, "but not systematically." She set the box on the desk and lifted the lid. Inside was a deep, disordered collection of folded papers. Jacob looked at the box. Then he looked at the afternoon light in the windows. "We'd better get started," he said. They worked through the afternoon together at the wide desk in the quiet study, passing papers back and forth, Lillian reading quickly and handing Jacob anything that might be relevant, Jacob making notes. They talked as they worked, which was something Jacob did not usually do because he found it distracting, but found was not distracting with Lillian because her conversation was on the same subject as the work and moved things forward rather than away. At some point, Mrs. Garza appeared in the doorway with coffee and a plate of sugar cookies, assessed the scene on the desk with the expression of someone evaluating a battlefield, and withdrew without comment. Jacob found 3 letters from Rutherford Cal, covering the period from October 1875 to January 1876. The first was the loan offer, which referred explicitly and only to repayment in monthly installments as discussed. The second was a confirmation of the arrangement. The third was a receipt for the first payment, None of the letters mentioned land, property, parcels, or any arrangement other than the cash repayment schedule. He set them side by side on the desk. Lillian looked at them for a long moment. Then she let out a slow breath that carried a great deal with it. "This is what we needed," Jacob said quietly. "He's going to claim these don't tell the whole story," she said. "He can claim whatever he likes." These letters, combined with the ledger records, create a clear documentary picture of the arrangement. The burden of proof is on Cal to establish the existence of the alleged oral promise, and the documentation is consistently inconsistent with that promise existing. A Texas court in 1878 is going to have a very difficult time granting a land claim based on an oral agreement when the written record shows 3 years of regular cash repayment with no mention of any land settlement. She was looking at him across the desk with an expression that was difficult to interpret, complex and layered. "Why are you doing this?" she asked. It was a direct question, and it deserved a direct answer, and he found that he had to think about what the honest answer was rather than the professionally adequate one. "Because it's right," he said. "And because," he stopped for a half-second, "I find that I can't be indifferent to what happens to you." The room was very quiet. The afternoon light had shifted while they worked and was now coming through both windows at a lower angle, filling the room with the amber warmth of late afternoon. Outside, somewhere in the barn, a horse stamped. One of the dogs barked once and then was silent. Lillian looked at him steadily. The composure was still there, but it was different now, more deliberate, more conscious, as though she was choosing to maintain it rather than simply wearing it. "I have been on my own for 2 years," she said. "Not an accusation, something more like the setting down of context." "I know," he said. "I'm not asking you for anything, Mrs. Wainwright," and then, because honesty required it, "Not today." Something shifted in her face. A very small thing, but real. "Lillian," she said. "You might as well call me Lillian." He felt something warm and significant settle in his chest. "Jacob," he said. She looked down at the letters arranged on the desk. "We should make copies of these before the hearing," she said, "and I should get these in front of a proper attorney." "You have one," he said. "If you want one," she looked up. "You represent Boggs. The Boggs matter based on the survey findings is effectively settled. If he's unwilling to accept the evidence and negotiate a proper boundary acknowledgement, then my obligation to him is concluded. I'll write to him tonight." He kept his voice even and professional. "And once that obligation is discharged, I'm a free agent. Cold Creek is not Amarillo," she said. "No," he agreed. "It's considerably more interesting." The smile that crossed her face then was not the brief, startled one from the first day. It was fuller and more deliberate, the smile of someone who has decided to be pleased and is owning the decision. It changed everything about the room, that smile. Harlan Boggs came to Cold Creek the following Monday, and he was not pleased. He was a large man, broad through the shoulders and wide through the jaw, with the permanently aggrieved expression of someone who had spent his life getting what he wanted and had not developed the emotional infrastructure to handle not getting it. He arrived with 2 of his ranch hands, which Jacob found mildly theatrical, and set up at the table in the hotel dining room as though it were a council of war. Jacob laid out the findings precisely and without softening. The Eastman markers confirmed the 1873 boundary. The county surveyor, Jim Brewer, had officially documented the northwest and northeast markers the previous Friday, and his report was already filed with the county clerk. The fence line on the Wainwright northern boundary was within 40 yards of the original 1871 survey, a discrepancy that almost certainly came from the natural drift of fence posts over 7 years, rather than from any deliberate encroachment. Boggs's face went through several colors during this presentation. "You're telling me," he said when Jacob finished, "that you came down here to represent my interests and you ended up proving the Wainwright woman's case." "I came down here to find the truth of the matter," Jacob said calmly. "The truth is that your fence is substantially in the right place, and the Wainwright boundary is substantially where it was always meant to be. The dispute is, effectively, without merit." I paid you a retainer, Boggs said dangerously, which covered my time and services. I have done what I was engaged to do, which was to establish the factual and legal basis of the boundary question. The facts do not support the claim. Jacob kept his hands flat on the table and his voice level. I would recommend that you acknowledge the boundary and negotiate a formal recorded agreement with the Wainwright estate to prevent future disputes. That protects your land too, Mr. Boggs. A recorded agreement is better than a disputed one. Boggs sat with this for a long moment. His ranch hands stared at the table. The hotel dining room was mercifully quiet. Fine, Boggs said finally, in a tone that suggested fine was the last word he had wanted to say. But I want it in writing, signed. So do I, Jacob said, and so does Mrs. Wainwright. The boundary agreement negotiation took 2 days. Jacob arranged it so that both parties, Boggs on one side and Lillian on the other, could review the drafted language and propose amendments, and he moved between them with the methodical patience of someone who had done this before and understood that the goal was not victory for either side but a document both would respect. Lillian, he noticed, was a very good negotiator. She knew exactly which points mattered and which were merely pride, and she conceded the pride points without much argument, which made Boggs feel he had gotten something, which made him more willing to give on the points that actually mattered. By Wednesday afternoon it was signed. The boundary was formally recorded. Jim Brewer's survey was attached. It was done. Lillian came out of the clerk's office with Jacob that afternoon, the final papers in her folio, and stood in the street with the same expression he had seen by the survey marker, that unguarded quality of someone who has won something hard. "One down," Jacob said. "One down," she agreed. She looked at him. "The hearing on Cal's claim is 3 weeks from tomorrow." "I know. I've been corresponding with a colleague in Amarillo about Cal's background." He had also received a reply, which had been illuminating. It turns out that Rutherford Cal has done this before. In 1875, in Lubbock County, he filed a similar oral promise land claim against the estate of a deceased creditor. The claim was dismissed, but not before Cal managed to delay the estate settlement long enough to pressure the widow into selling at a reduced price. Lillian's jaw tightened. "He's not after the land specifically," Jacob said. "He's after the pressure that the claim creates. He expects you to settle out of court rather than go through a hearing." "He is going to be disappointed," she said, with a quiet ferocity that Jacob found more compelling than a dramatic proclamation. "I thought so," he said. "I'd like to represent you at the hearing if you'll have me." "I'll have you," she said, and then, as though the simplicity of the answer had surprised her slightly, she looked away at the street and added more carefully, "as my attorney." "Naturally," he said, and if there was a smile in his voice he managed not to let it into his face. She turned back to him. "Are you staying in Cold Creek, then?" "For the foreseeable future," he said. They were standing in the middle of the street, the usual traffic of the town moving around them, horses and wagons and people with their business to attend to, and they were standing completely still in the middle of it, looking at each other, which was perhaps more obvious than either of them intended. "You should come to supper," she said. "Saturday. Mrs. Garza is cooking a proper meal and Hector will be there with his wife Maria, and it would be," she chose the word with care, "appropriate since we have business to discuss." "Saturday," he said. "Yes." Saturday's supper at the Double W was not primarily a business discussion. This was evident from the moment Jacob arrived and found the house lit with warm lamplight and Mrs. Garza's cooking filling the air with the smell of chilies and beef and fresh tortillas, and Hector's wife Maria, a small bright-eyed woman who laughed easily and spoke in a fluent mix of Spanish and English, and Lillian in a dress that was neither formal nor simple, but something in between that suited her in the way that things suit people when they have not been chosen for the purpose of being noticed. They ate on the long porch in the cooling evening because the house was warm from the cooking, and the sky over the flat Texas country showed first one star and then many, the way that clear summer nights in the Panhandle unfolded like a slow revelation. the darkness deepening by degrees until the whole dome overhead was thick with stars. Jacob found himself talking more than he usually did. Hector asked questions about the law, practical questions. What rights did a ranch hand have if an employer died? Maria asked about Amarillo, whether it had a Catholic church, which it did. Lillian mostly listened in these conversations and watched him with her steady winter sage eyes. And once, when Hector made a joke he found genuinely funny and he laughed, he caught her watching the laughter with a look that she did not quite manage to make neutral before he saw it. After Hector and Maria had gone home and Mrs. Garza had cleared the table and retired to her rooms at the back of the house, Lillian and Jacob sat on the porch in the dark with coffee cups and the sound of the night out across the grass, the distant calling of night birds and the occasional movement of cattle in the dark pasture. "My husband was a good man," she said, not looking at him, looking at the dark. "I want you to know that I was not unhappy with him." Jacob understood that she was not saying this to close a door. She was saying it honestly, setting a context because she was an honest person. Hector said he was well thought of, Jacob said. He was. She turned her coffee cup in her hands. He died very suddenly, a horse that had been gentle for years. These things happen. She was quiet for a moment. I spent a year being angry about how arbitrary it was. How a good man can simply be gone in an afternoon and there is no reason and no answer. "I'm sorry," he said. "I don't want sympathy," she said, quickly and then more gently. "I mean, thank you. I know you mean it. But what I'm trying to say is that I came through it. I came back here and I took care of my father and I managed the ranch and I got through to the other side of it." She looked at him then. "And I am not a woman who is afraid of being alone. I want you to understand that." "I do understand that," he said. "It's one of the things I find most remarkable about you." The word remarkable settled into the night air and stayed there. She looked at him for a long moment. "What else?" she said quietly, and the question had a particular quality to it, a testing-the-edge quality, the way you put your foot on ice to see if it will hold. He set his coffee cup down carefully on the porch rail. "Your mind," he said, "the way you think through problems, the way you fought for this land without anyone fighting with you." He kept his voice quiet, and even because the evening felt like something that would shatter if he wasn't careful. "The fact that you smiled exactly once in the first 2 days, and I spent the rest of the time trying to figure out how to make it happen again." She was very still. The night sounds went on around them. "Jacob," she said, and his name in her mouth, not Mr. Monroe but Jacob, had a weight to it. "I'm not asking you for anything," he said again. "I told you that and I meant it, but I'd rather be honest with you than careful." She stood up and moved to the porch rail, leaning on it and looking out at the dark pasture. He waited. "My father used to say," she said eventually, "that the trouble with careful men is that they wait too long and by the time they decide, the moment is gone." She turned around and leaned back against the rail, facing him. He was not always right, but he was right about that. Jacob stood up. He crossed the porch, which was not wide, and stopped a foot in front of her. She looked up at him with that direct, clear gaze that did not waver. "Lillian," he said. "Jacob," she said. He kissed her gently. "The way you approach something you have been looking at from a distance and finally get to touch, carefully and with complete attention." She kissed him back with a decisiveness that was entirely consistent with her character, and her hands came up to his forearms and held there, and the night went on around them, stars and dark grass and the distant sound of the world carrying on, and nothing in it mattered as much as this. They stood on the porch for a long time after that, not speaking, her head eventually resting against his shoulder, his arm around her, looking at the stars over the flat horizon. "This is very complicated," she said finally. "Yes," he agreed. "You live in Amarillo. I do currently live in Amarillo, and you have a practice there. I have a practice that primarily consists of cattle law and land disputes," he said. "There is no shortage of cattle law and land disputes in the Texas Panhandle." She was quiet for a moment. "Are you suggesting something?" "I'm suggesting," he said carefully, "that nothing about my situation in Amarillo is permanent or impossible to change." And I'm not suggesting you would need to go anywhere you don't want to go. She lifted her head from his shoulder and looked at him in the dark. You've been here 2 weeks, she said. I know, he said. That's very fast. It is, he agreed. I'll admit I don't entirely recognize myself in it. She looked at him for a long time, and he had the feeling of being genuinely seen, which was not always comfortable but which, in her case, he found he did not mind. She was not romanticizing him. She was looking at him with the same clear attention she brought to survey documents and ledger books, and finding him, apparently, satisfactory. We'll see how the hearing goes, she said, which was not a rejection. It was Lillian being practical, and he had learned enough about her to know that her practicality was not a barrier to her feelings. It was how she managed them, and he could respect that entirely. The weeks leading up to the Cal hearing were busy in a way that Jacob found genuinely satisfying, the kind of work that requires all of your attention and rewards it. He spent time at the ranch and time in town, building the legal case systematically. The ledger records were carefully transcribed and organized. The 3 letters from Cal were documented. The response from his Amarillo colleague about Cal's prior activity in Lubbock County was formalized into an affidavit from the attorney who had handled that case. Jacob also tracked down 2 men in Cold Creek who had done business with Cal over the years, both of whom were willing to testify to Cal's character for opportunism, though Jacob was careful about this because character evidence was limited in its usefulness, and he did not want to make the case personal when the documents were so compelling. He also, during these weeks, courted Lillian Wainwright in the ways available to a man of his position and time. He brought her a book from the general store, a novel she had mentioned wanting to read. He rode with her on the boundary inspection she needed to do for the now formal Boggs agreement. He sat with her on the porch after work in the evenings when she invited him, which was most evenings toward the end of the 2nd week, and talked with her about everything and nothing, cattle prices and legal philosophy and what she remembered of her mother and what he remembered of Tennessee, and whether the stars looked different over flat land than over mountains, which was a question they discussed for an entire evening without resolving. They kissed again on the 4th evening, and on the 5th. Not dramatically or urgently, but with the deepening ease of people who are learning something new and finding it good. Hector, who was not given to unnecessary comment, said to Lillian one morning, in Jacob's hearing, "He is a good man." And Lillian said, "I know." And Hector nodded and went back to fixing the fence post he'd been working on, and that was the whole of it. The Cal hearing was held in the county courthouse, a severe frame building with insufficient shade trees and a courtroom that was already warm at 9 in the morning when proceedings began. Judge Lawrence Alderton, who had ridden up from the district seat in Clarendon, was a small, precise man with steel-rimmed glasses and the manner of someone who had heard every possible argument and had been bored by most of them. Rutherford Cal was exactly as Lillian had described him, a snake in a good suit. He was perhaps 50, well-dressed in the manner of someone who wanted to project prosperity, silver at his temples and a practiced sincerity in his manner. His attorney, a man named Graves from Clarendon, was technically competent and had clearly prepared a version of the case that emphasized the alleged oral promise and Cal's long business relationship with Gerald Wainwright as a basis for trust. Jacob let them present first. Cal testified that Gerald Wainwright had verbally promised him the eastern 80 acres of the Double W as final settlement of the remaining debt, that this promise had been made in early 1878 before Gerald's final heart episode, and that it had been witnessed by an employee of Cal's named Stubbs, who was also present to testify. The Stubbs testimony was thin, obviously coached, and full of convenient vagueness. Jacob cross-examined Stubbs with focused patience, asking him to recall specific details, the date, the time of day, what Cal and Wainwright had been doing before and after the alleged conversation, whether there had been anyone else present, what exactly the words were that had been used. Stubbs's answers became progressively less confident and more circular under this treatment, and by the end of the cross-examination, the judge was looking at the witness with the particular expression of a man who has measured something and found it wanting. Then Jacob presented the ledger records. He walked through them methodically, entry by entry, demonstrating the consistent monthly repayment pattern. He explained the arithmetic. $3,200 repaid over 39 months against a $4,000 loan, with $800 outstanding as of Gerald Wainwright's death. He produced the 3 letters from Cal himself, emphasizing that the letter confirming the loan arrangement made explicit reference only to cash repayment installments. He presented the affidavit from his Amarillo colleague detailing Cal's similar prior action in Lubbock County. He called Lillian to testify. She was clear, precise, and entirely composed on the stand, which he knew cost her something because he had seen her in the evenings when the weight of all of this showed on her face, and he knew the composure was a choice. She described the loan, the repayment records, her father's state of mind and business practices, and the absence of any mention of a land arrangement in any conversation or document she had access to. Graves cross-examined her, trying to suggest that she had not been privy to all her father's business arrangements, which was technically true. Jacob objected where appropriate and let Lillian handle the rest, which she did with a calm precision that he suspected was more effective with Judge Alderton than a dramatic emotional performance would have been. The judge considered for 20 minutes. He then delivered his ruling from the bench, which was not always done, and Jacob understood that Alderton had made up his mind relatively early and had spent the 20 minutes writing out his reasoning rather than forming it. The ruling was in Lillian's favor. Cal's claim was dismissed. The documentary evidence of a consistent cash repayment arrangement was found to be inconsistent with the existence of the alleged oral property promise. The testimony of the witness Stubbs was found to be insufficiently credible to overcome that documentary record. Lillian Wainwright was confirmed as the sole legal owner of the Double W Ranch, all parcels. The courtroom was small and the gallery was the usual Cold Creek mix of people with business there and people with nothing better to do that morning. And when the ruling came, there was a murmur that was not loud but was general. Jacob was watching Lillian's face. She did not cry, and she did not exult, and she did not turn to him with any dramatic gesture. She simply closed her eyes for one brief moment, and when she opened them she was looking at the front of the courtroom with an expression that was private and whole and very much her own. He had the professional instinct to shake her hand, which he did, formally, in front of the courtroom. And then he had the personal instinct to hold it for a half-second longer than a handshake warranted. She let him. Rutherford Cal left the courtroom without looking at either of them, which was the correct behavior for a man who had just been publicly found to be attempting fraud, and who should have been grateful that the judge had not gone further in his commentary. Outside the courthouse in the bright noon light, Hector was waiting with Maria and 2 other ranch hands who had come to town for the occasion. Maria embraced Lillian immediately and with considerable enthusiasm. Hector shook Jacob's hand with the gravity of a man conferring a significant acknowledgement. "I owe you a great deal," Lillian said to Jacob when the others had moved a few feet away. "You owe me my legal fee," he said, "which we should discuss." She laughed. It was not the small, restrained smile from the beginning. It was a genuine laugh, unguarded and full, and it was the most beautiful thing he had seen in a very long time. "Dinner," she said, "at the ranch, tonight. Come to dinner." "I will," he said. That evening at the Double W had a quality different from all the previous evenings. There was something released in the house, some tension that had lived in the walls for months and was now gone. Mrs. Garza cooked with evident celebration, producing a meal of impractical abundance that everyone ate with equal enthusiasm. Hector brought a bottle of something that he said was wine, but which was almost certainly something made by his cousin and considerably stronger, and toasts were made in 2 languages. Jacob sat across the table from Lillian and watched her laugh and eat and talk, and felt something that he recognized as the kind of certainty that does not require explanation. He had spent 31 years being a sensible and methodical man who understood what he wanted and generally knew how to get it. And he had ridden into Cold Creek 3 weeks ago with a satchel full of survey notes thinking about property lines, and everything was now entirely different, which was the strangest and best thing that had ever happened to him. After dinner, when Mrs. Garza had gone to bed and Hector and Maria had ridden home in their wagon, Jacob and Lillian sat on the porch again. The stars were out in full force. The night was warmer than it had been on previous evenings, the deep summer heat working its way even into the nights now. "What happens next?" Lillian asked. It was the question she had been not quite asking for days, and now she was asking it, looking at him directly in the way she always looked at things she needed to understand clearly. Jacob had been thinking about what happens next with considerable concentration for the better part of a week, which was something he did not tell her directly, because the way he had been thinking about it would have sounded, in summary, alarmingly fast. But the honest truth was that Jacob Monroe was not a man who failed to recognize a clear answer to an important question when the evidence was unambiguous. "I'd like to stay in Cold Creek," he said. "There's enough legal work in this county to support a practice. I've already spoken to Judge Alderton about the possibility, and he was encouraging." She was very still. "Spoken to Alderton. When?" "Yesterday morning, before the hearing." "You decided before the hearing," she said. She was not accusing him of anything. She was just noting the sequence of events. "The Cal case was always going to go the way it went, given the evidence," he said. "My decision about where to live did not need to wait for the outcome." "It needed to wait for something," she said. "It's been waiting," he said, "for you to be ready to have this conversation." She looked at him with that deep, clear attention. The porch was quiet around them, the dark Texas night enormous and indifferent beyond its edges. "I'm not going to pretend this is not fast," she said. "It is fast," he agreed. "I've been through enough to know that slow doesn't mean safe," she said. "James and I were cautious. We knew each other for a year before we married, and he was gone in an afternoon." She shook her head, not angrily but thoughtfully. "I don't think speed or slowness is the point." "What is the point?" She looked at him steadily. "Whether it's real." "It's real," he said. "Yes," she said. "I know it is." She pulled in a breath. "I'm also aware that I am sitting here considering the permanence of a man I've known for 3 weeks, which is the kind of thing that would have made me roll my eyes at another woman 6 months ago." "What would you say to that other woman now?" he asked. The smile came then, that full, real smile. "I'd say that sometimes the answer is obvious," she said. "And being stubborn about the obvious is just a different kind of cowardice." He stood up and crossed to where she was sitting and held out his hand to her, the same way you offer a hand to someone at the edge of something high, not demanding, just offering. She looked at it for one long moment and then took it and stood, and they faced each other on the porch in the dark with the stars overhead and the ranch stretching out in the night around them. "I'm not a romantic man by nature," he said. "I'm better with arguments than with declarations, but I want to be here. I want this." "I want you." "Jacob," she said. "Yes. Ask me," she said. He understood what she meant. He had been, in fact, working up to it for a week, in the methodical way that he worked up to everything, marshaling the relevant considerations, and now, standing here on the porch in the dark with her hand in his and the whole vast Texas night around them, the methodology fell away, and it was simply real and present and immediate. "Lillian Wainwright," he said, "will you marry me?" She said yes. She said it simply and clearly, the way she said things that she meant completely. And then she laughed a little. And then she kissed him, and he put both arms around her and held her in the warm dark of the Texas night, and felt the particular completeness of a man who has found the thing he had not known he was looking for. They were married on a Saturday in September of 1878, in the small white church at the edge of Cold Creek, which was attended by a greater number of townspeople than either of them had expected, because Cold Creek was not a large town and a wedding was not nothing. Mrs. Garza cried continuously from the second pew and seemed to regard this as appropriate. Hector stood up for Jacob with the dignity of a man who took such responsibilities seriously. Maria stood up for Lillian and wept less than Mrs. Garza but smiled more. Judge Alderton, who had stayed on in Cold Creek for an additional land matter, attended as a guest and told Jacob afterward that he had made an excellent choice, which, coming from a man who evaluated choices professionally, was a compliment of some substance. Lillian wore a dress the color of cream that had been her mother's, altered to fit her, and her copper hair was pinned up with small pearl-headed pins that had also been her mother's, and she walked down the aisle of the small church with the same composed decisiveness with which she did everything. And when she reached him at the front and looked at him, it was with that clear winter-sage gaze that saw him fully, and he thought he had never felt so completely and honestly known by anyone. He moved into the double W. He had very little to move, a man's possessions being largely portable in those years, his books and his legal satchels and his clothes in general, the roan gelding, who adapted to the double W's barn with equanimity. Jacob set up a small office in one of the spare rooms of the house, advertised his services in the Cold Creek Gazette, and within a month had 4 clients, 2 more land matters, an estate question, and a business dispute between a mercantile owner and a supplier, which was not exciting but was work and was real. The autumn on the Panhandle was extraordinary. Jacob had spent autumns in the East and in Amarillo, but the fall light on the wide flat range had a quality he could not have described before experiencing it, gold and enormous and poignant in the way of things that are beautiful and temporary. He and Lillian rode the ranch together on Saturday mornings, inspecting the herd and the fence lines, and he learned from her about cattle and grazing and the specific demands of a Panhandle winter, which she explained with the practical expertise of someone who had been doing it since adolescence. She learned from him how to read a legal document with close attention, and they spent several evenings going through the formal boundary agreement with the Boggs Ranch, identifying sections that would need to be renewed when it expired, and discussing whether there was a simpler form that would be more durable. These conversations were among his favorites, not because of the legal content but because of the quality of her attention, the way she engaged with ideas as though they mattered, which to her, everything did. Winter came hard and fast in late November, the way it did in the Panhandle, without much apology. The first norther blew through on a Friday evening, dropping the temperature 40 degrees in 2 hours and laying a thin coat of ice on the water troughs by morning. They were snowed in for 3 days in December, which under different circumstances would have been inconvenient, and under current circumstances was rather the opposite. Jacob discovered that Lillian played the piano, an old upright that had been in the house since her childhood, and that she played it well, favoring the slow, serious pieces rather than the quick, rollicking ones. He discovered that she was occasionally prone to a particular mood, not sadness exactly, but a kind of inward turning, usually in the evenings, usually when something had reminded her of her father or of James Creston, and that the best response to this mood was not to try to resolve it or distract it, but simply to be present in the same room, which she seemed to find sufficient. He appreciated this because he had the same quality in himself and had always been slightly ashamed of it, and her easy acceptance of it in him made him accept it in himself somewhat better. She discovered that he was a poor cook, which she had expected, and that he was a surprisingly good carpenter, which she had not, and that he had a habit of reading while walking, which she found simultaneously impressive and alarming. She discovered that he had a very low tolerance for injustice and a very high tolerance for difficult conversations, which were useful qualities in a lawyer and in a husband. She discovered that he was the kind of man who said what he meant and meant what he said, which after a life in a world that frequently required reading between the lines she found inexpressibly restful. In the spring of 1879, they learned that Lillian was expecting a child. She told him in the kitchen one morning in March with a directness that was entirely characteristic, while he was drinking his coffee and reading a brief he had been preparing. He set the brief down, and for a moment he simply looked at her, standing in the morning light in the kitchen doorway with the flat Texas spring visible through the window behind her. "Are you well?" he asked. "Perfectly well," she said. "I've been well for 6 weeks since I knew." "6 weeks," he said. "I wanted to be certain before saying anything," she said. And then, with a vulnerability that was less common in her but more precious when it appeared, "Are you pleased?" He crossed the kitchen in 4 steps and held her in the direct, unceremonious way he held her when something mattered very much, and said into her hair, "I'm more pleased than I know how to say, which you know is saying something." She laughed and put her arms around him, and they stood in the kitchen in the morning light while the coffee got cold, and neither of them minded. The summer of 1879 was easier than the previous one because the ranch was fully secure, the legal disputes resolved, the ranch properly staffed, and Jacob's practice in Cold Creek was generating enough income that the pressure that had lived in Lillian's face for the first months of their acquaintance was entirely gone, replaced by something that he thought of privately as her actual face, the one underneath the composure and the fighting stance, which was warmer and more openly alive, and which he was the primary witness to, which he found to be among the most significant privileges of his life. Their son was born in October of 1879, a healthy boy with Jacob's dark hair and Lillian's winter sage eyes, who cried vigorously and ate well and slept in manageable intervals, which Lillian described as a cooperative temperament and Jacob described as good sense. They named him Thomas Gerald Monroe, Thomas for Jacob's grandfather who had taught him to read, Gerald for the man who had built the double W and left it to his daughter to defend, and who deserved to be remembered in the child that daughter had managed to carry through to the other side of everything. Hector appeared in the yard the morning after Thomas was born, hat in hand, and asked to see the child with the formal seriousness of a man paying a significant call. Maria brought more food than any household needed, and Mrs. Garza had to be gently persuaded to set the baby down and let him sleep. The ranch hands who had been with Lillian through the bad year came one by one to the porch and took their hats off, and something in that felt right to Jacob, felt like the proper acknowledgement of what it had meant to hold this place against the forces that had wanted to take it. Thomas grew, and the seasons turned, and Jacob Monroe's legal practice grew with them. He took on cases throughout the county, rode the circuit occasionally when the district court needed him, and in 1880 one was approached about standing for county attorney, a position he declined because the ranch needed him, and the independent practice was more useful to more people. But the fact of being asked told him something about the standing he had built in the community. Lillian expanded the ranch's cattle operation in 1880, making an arrangement with a breeder in Fort Worth for improved stock, and negotiated the deal herself with Jacob available to review the contract, which she handed back to him the first time with 3 sections marked in pencil and a look that said she had found them herself and was not particularly impressed. He reviewed her markings, confirmed she was right on all 3 counts, and told her she should have been the lawyer. She said she was quite busy enough being what she was. The boundary agreement with Boggs came up for renewal in 1882. Boggs was a more reasonable man by then, having had 4 years to adjust to having a formally recorded border with a neighbor who had a lawyer in the family, and the negotiation was significantly easier than the first. He and Jacob drank whiskey afterward on the porch of the Boggs ranch house, and Boggs admitted, in the manner of a man who did not apologize easily, that the boundary record had been good for both properties. "Your wife is a formidable woman," Boggs said. "She is," Jacob agreed with genuine pride. "How'd she end up with a lawyer for a husband instead of another rancher?" Jacob looked at his glass. "I rode into town to settle a land dispute," he said. In 1883, their daughter was born. They named her Lillian Monroe. She arrived with red hair so specifically copper that Jacob stood looking at her in Lillian's arms the first time and said, "There you are," which Lillian thought was the strangest and most accurate thing anyone had ever said about a newborn. Alina had Lillian's coloring and Jacob's particular tendency to regard the world with intense analytical attention, which in a person of her age expressed itself primarily as an unwillingness to look away from anything that moved or made a sound, which made her both exhausting and delightful. Thomas, who was 3.5 by Alina's arrival, accepted his sister's existence with the philosophical pragmatism of a child who had learned that the world contained more than he was initially informed of, and that this was generally worth investigating. He was, by then, a confident walker and an enthusiastic talker who had divided the world into things that were interesting and things that were not and spent his energy accordingly, which Jacob recognized as a temperamental inheritance and which Lillian claimed was entirely Jacob's doing. The double W grew. The legal practice grew. Cold Creek itself grew slowly, as more families settled the Panhandle and more ranches were established, and more disputes arose that required someone to sort them out calmly and correctly. Jacob Monroe was known as the man for that work, and the reputation brought him cases that were interesting and a few that were more interesting than he had bargained for, including a water rights dispute in 1884 that went to the state court and occupied him for 6 months and which he won, establishing a precedent for water allocation on shared creek systems that a colleague told him was still being cited 20 years later. But those were the large landmarks of the professional life, significant but not primary. What was primary was smaller and more constant. The kitchen in the mornings with the coffee and the sound of children and Lillian's voice across the room. The Saturday rides that had become a fixed institution. The evenings on the porch in every season, spring and summer and fall and the brief brutal winters, watching the sky and talking or not talking, both having become equally comfortable over the years. The way she looked at him still, with that clear attention that saw him fully, which had not dimmed or softened into habit because Lillian Wainwright was not a woman whose attention softened into anything. Thomas Monroe, at 8 years old, announced that he intended to be a rancher and not a lawyer, which Lillian accepted with perfect equanimity and Jacob accepted with approximately 3 days of mild private disappointment, before recognizing that his son was his own person with his own clear sense of himself, which was not a flaw but a direct inheritance of the best quality in both his parents. Alina Monroe, at 5, showed no particular inclination toward anything except demanding to know how everything worked, which Jacob privately thought might resolve itself in several directions, all of them interesting. There were hard years within the good years, as there always were. A drought in 1885 was bad for the herd. A fever went through the school the following winter and Thomas was sick for 2 weeks, and Jacob and Lillian took turns sitting up with him. And on the third night when the fever was at its worst and Thomas was small and hot and frightened in the bed, Jacob looked across the room at Lillian's face in the lamplight and saw something there that was the measure of how much was at stake in every moment of this life, how much love was also always held beside fear. He crossed the room and took her hand, and they sat together beside the bed until the fever broke toward dawn. The fence on the east boundary, which had been quiet since the cow matter, needed complete rebuilding in 1886. Hector organized the work, and Jacob rode out with the crew for 3 days of actual fence work, which reminded him emphatically that he was a lawyer and not a ranch hand, but which he was glad of anyway because Hector seemed to find it good that he came. Rutherford Cow, as Lillian had discovered through the Cold Creek grapevine, had moved to New Mexico territory after his failed claim and was reportedly operating a questionable land speculation business there. Jacob occasionally wondered whether someone would eventually stop him properly, and trusted that someone would. The years settled into each other, with the satisfying accumulation of a life being well lived. Jacob turned 40 in 1887, which happened on a Sunday, and Lillian organized a dinner to which she invited everyone he knew in Cold Creek, and several he did not know he knew, and there was a great deal of eating and talking. And at one point Thomas played a song on the harmonica he had been learning for 3 months with a degree of confidence significantly exceeding his accuracy. And Alina sat on Jacob's lap and ate 2 pieces of cake, because she had convinced both her parents she had not had any yet, which he did not discover until afterward, and which Lillian told him he deserved for not paying attention. He thought, sitting on the porch that night after the guests had gone and the children were in bed, that this was the shape of a happy life, not dramatic, not untroubled, but full and real and known, inhabited by someone who saw him clearly and stayed anyway, who had fought for this land and for herself and had let him fight alongside her, and had built something with him that was larger and more solid than either of them would have managed alone. "What are you thinking?" Lillian asked from the chair beside him. "That I came to Cold Creek to settle a land dispute," he said. She said, "How did that go?" "Extremely well," he said, "all things considered." She reached across the space between their chairs and took his hand, the same decisive clasp as always, and he held it in the dark, and the summer night went on around them, and the ranch was quiet with the particular night quiet of a working place at rest, and somewhere in the house their children were sleeping, and the stars over the flat Texas country were abundant and indifferent and beautiful. "Jacob," she said. "Yes," he said. "I'm glad you stayed," she said. He looked at her in the dark, at the copper hair gone to shadow and the winter sage eyes catching the distant light from the window, at the face that he knew now in all its versions, composed and unguarded, laughing and serious, tired and animated, always honest, always itself. "So am I," he said, "every single day." The night settled around them, and they sat together on the porch of the Double W in the summer of 1887 in the heart of the Texas Panhandle, and the land that she had fought for, and he had helped her keep lay out in all directions around them, theirs and earned and real, and the life they had built together was complete in the way that good things are complete, not perfect but whole, not without cost but fully worth it. A life that had begun with a man riding into a dusty town with a satchel full of survey notes and no particular destination beyond the next legal matter, and had become, through the particular alchemy of one woman's clear eyes and honest heart, everything he had not known to look for and could no longer imagine being without. The roan gelding general lived to the remarkable age of 23 and was retired to the south pasture in his later years, where Thomas Monroe, who understood horses the way his grandfather had understood cattle, made a particular project of the old horse's comfort. Alina Monroe, at 7, named him Sir General and fed him stolen carrots from the kitchen garden with the same negotiating confidence she had applied to her birthday cake. Thomas grew straight and strong and learned the ranch from Hector with the same methodical dedication that Jacob had put into his law books. And by the time he was 12, it was clear that the Double W would be in capable hands when its time came. Alina, who had spent her early years wanting to know how everything worked, developed a particular attachment to her father's legal books and a habit of reading them in the evenings, and Jacob caught her once at the age of 9 reading a treatise on property law with the focused attention of someone who expected to use it, and felt a complicated and profound pride that he did not mention to Lillian only because he knew she had already noticed. In the spring of 1889, Lillian came to him in the office where he was preparing a contract for a neighboring rancher's cattle sale, and stood in the doorway with a particular look on her face that he had seen exactly once before. He set down his pen. She said, "The house is going to be full again in the fall." He rose from his desk. He crossed the room. He held her the same way he always held her when something mattered completely, and said against her hair, "Good," and she laughed, and the sound of it went through the house, and out the open window into the spring air and across the yard and into the wide-open Texas morning. And somewhere in the barn Hector heard it and smiled without knowing exactly why, only knowing that it was the sound of a household that was well. Their second son was born in November of 1889, and they named him William Jacob Monroe, William for Lillian's grandfather, Jacob for himself, because Lillian said that a father whose name was not in the house at all was a father being modest to the point of ingratitude, and Jacob had no serious argument against this. The double W went on. The law practice went on. Cold Creek grew, slowly acquiring more permanence and more intention. A proper schoolhouse, a second church, a bank, a doctor's office with a permanent physician rather than a traveling one. All the incremental signs of a community deciding to become something that would last. Jacob Monroe was part of making it last, and he knew this, and the knowledge sat comfortably in him alongside everything else. And on the evenings when the work was done and the children were in bed and the ranch was quiet, and he and Lillian sat on the porch of the house that her father had built and she had kept and they had made their own, he thought of the man he had been when he rode into Cold Creek in the summer of 1878, certain of what he was doing and entirely wrong about what mattered, and he was grateful for every single thing that had complicated that certainty and led him here to this porch, to this woman, to this life. He had ridden into Cold Creek to settle a land dispute. He had settled it, and then entirely unexpectedly and completely irreversibly he had stayed. Lillian, who could read him as clearly as she could read a survey map, said one evening, "You're thinking about the beginning again." "Is it obvious?" he asked. "Only to me," she said. "Good," he said. She was quiet for a moment. "No regrets," he looked at her. The question was not serious, not really, not after 11 years and 3 children and more seasons on this porch than he could count. But she asked it with a small, genuine curiosity, the way she asked everything she wanted to actually know. "Not one," he said. "Not a single one." She leaned her head against his shoulder, which she did sometimes in the evenings now with an ease that still moved him because it had been earned, by time and trust, and the accumulated daily choosing of each other through everything that life in the Panhandle, and the law and the years put in front of them. "Good," she said. "Neither do I." The stars came out over the double W, enormous and familiar, the same stars that had watched over the original survey in 1871, and the boundary dispute in 1878, and a wedding in September of the same year, and the births of 3 children, and the death of 1 good horse, and the endless turning of seasons on the wide flat land of the Texas Panhandle. They went on overhead without regard for any of it, which was as it should be, because some things were too large and too constant to require acknowledgement, and others, the specific and particular and irreplaceable things, the warmth of a hand, the clarity of a gaze, the sound of a woman's laugh in a house full of children and life, those things were small enough to hold and large enough to be everything. Jacob Monroe held them. He knew exactly what he had. And the night went on, and the land went on, and everything that mattered was right here, on this porch, in this life, with this woman, and it was enough. And it was more than enough, and it was the most real thing he had ever known.